Okay. So welcome everyone to Queer Writers Writing Across Borders. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder with my partner Donnie Jokum of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. And we are a queer bookstore in New York City. We've been here since 2012 and we've been at the LGBT Center since 2014. And we've been living on the internet since March 13th, like many of us. So we're just doing online events now. Our store is closed, as is the LGBT Community Center, but we are continuing to do online events, and we just launched an online store very recently. So I'm going to quickly show you that, where you can buy some of the authors' works, and then we'll get started. So here we go. So if you just go to bgsqd.com/store, you scroll down to our featured products and you will see books by tonight's authors and many others. So please check that out. We have over 400 titles there now, and we're continuing to add more and more. And there are, of course, gift certificates. I also want to mention that we're recording all of our online events and posting them to our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who wanted to be here tonight and was unable to make it, they'll be able to see that on our YouTube channel. So that's all from me. I'm going to turn it over to William Johnson from Lambda Literary, and we're going to get started. So thank you very much.
All right, welcome everyone to a truly international event. We are tonight talking about queerness and through an international lens, and how that queerness operates in their work and how that has changed over time. So I guess I want everyone to consider this as kind of a queer literary world tour from the comfort of your own home. Before we get started, I just want to explain kind of the run of the show. We're going to start off with each writer talking a little bit about their work, and some writers will actually be reading their work this evening. Then afterwards, we'll be followed by a discussion moderated by yours truly. And then we're going to have a Q&A from the audience. So what I'm going to ask is that if audience members can just drop your questions in the chat, I'll be picking them up and asking I'll be pulling questions from the general office audience and sending them to the panelists. As Greg mentioned, I am the Deputy Director for Lambda Literary. Lambda Literary is an organization that is dedicated to supporting GLBT literature. Let me put I'm going to put Lambda's website in the chat as we discuss, so people can kind of see what we do. And if you have any questions, definitely I will put my email in the chat after the discussion. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first panelist that I'm going to bring center stage is Kiran Bhat, and they are going to be talking about their work and their writing. So let's get it started.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, William. I really appreciate it. And I have to thank all of you, both the fellow panelists and the people who have chosen to enjoy a Thursday night with us. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Kiran Bhat. I'm an Indian-American author, polyglot, and traveler. I've been all over the world. I've learned a lot of different things over a decade, traveling and living in different parts of the world. And from that come a lot of the concerns of my work. Of course, queerness also has to be a part of it because I happen to be gay. I happen to be one of the LGBT people. So I have to ultimately think in a way that intersects that internationalism with that also LGBTness. And so a lot of my work sits in the intersections of those two worlds. I'm working right now, for example, on a novel that very much is centralized on that theme. It's called Girar, which means to turn in Spanish. And it involves this mother and father who are an archetype of these kinds of experiences, a mother who is desperately lonely, who's religious, who's living a life alone without her son, and then this father who's very addicted to work and who spends all of his life thinking about those practical things, and these two parents who are missing having their child at home, who has gone off to live in another country, who's gay and they can't understand it necessarily. And it's a little bit obviously based on someone you might know. However, I also, being a person of many different backgrounds, did not find it easy to set a scene in one particular country. And I'm a person who very much believes that, I believe that I belong to the world and my narrative is global. And so I decided to set each of the installments in a different corner of the world. It'll take place in 365 different corners right now. And it's going to be taking place over a decade. And one of my goals is to stream the novel as it happens in real time so that you get excerpts of this greater global story as, say 2023, April 17th, you're getting a story in Kiribati. Or in April 23rd, 2027, you'll be getting something in Fiji or in Togo or in some village in the Congo or in even a village in Canada or in Australia. So I wanted to play with how we represent time and to place things in a way that is both immediate, both very international, but also very local and around a story that's very close to my heart. I also like to write in different languages. I happen to manage in 12 languages, and I've written a little bit in Mandarin, my mother tongue Kannada, Turkish, Spanish, and Portuguese. So my work kind of strands a lot of different literatures and languages, but of course always as a foreigner trying to dabble in them a little bit. I think I have about 2 minutes left. I don't know what I can do with 2 minutes. I could read a little bit from my work, but it might not be a lot. So I'll just read like a paragraph. This is a story that is an excerpt of Hirar that just got published in a literary journal called Kitab. The Warung was in the southern side of Yogyakarta, where the city met the southbound highway, far from the bright lights of Malioboro Street and the neon pink cars full of tourists patrolling the palace. The stall was surrounded by an array of plastic chairs and wooden stools, as disheveled as the vendor's hair. It was 9 in the evening. Mother wished they had kept driving. It was Kliwon, the day on which the South Sea goddess was most aligned with the mind of mortals. It didn't matter when you prayed, whether it was 6 in the morning or minute before midnight, as long as the prayer was genuine. But as the day wore on, the sea grew wilder and wilder. She had wanted to go earlier, but thanks to the pandemic, father had been forced to work overtime. At least he could come home at all and was willing to indulge mother's need to pray. Nevertheless, during the drive, father's exhaustion showed. His stomach growled loudly, and she remembered that she had been in such a rush to leave that she had forgotten to feed him dinner. The vendor brought out father's steaming nasi goreng. Immediately, father squeezed fresh chilies over the rice and sprinkled crushed crabs. He topped this with enough ketchup manis and sauce sambal for a whole family. As he ate, his stomach burped contentedly, but in the lamplight, he looked particularly aged. Mother remembered how he had complained the car. You know how late I come home. Who wants to drive to the other side of Jogja at this hour? I've run out of time. That's only 2 paragraphs, but I'll be happy to put the rest of the story in the chat box, and anyone who wants to read it later after this panel can do so. Thank you for your time, and I look forward now from hearing from a really unique and original Canada-based Australian voice named Tom, who also probably has multiple hyphens that I'm all confusing right now.
Okay, it's important to unmute myself, I just realized. Just before I click start on my timer, I just want to firstly, even though this talk is happening, online, we all, of course, have a physical location. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous people on whose land I'm living. I'm actually a settler twice over. I used to live in Australia, in Naarm, or as it came to be called Melbourne, and now I'm based in Takaronto, or as it's come to be called Toronto. And I want to acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat as the past, present, and future custodians of this land. I'm actually going to start with an excerpt, a little reading from my collection of fictions, Look Who's Morphing, the opening of the book and the opening of the first story that I wrote called Dirty Dancing. This is the summer of 1963 and everybody is calling me baby. I am at a resort with my Auntie Feng and Uncle Stan for a holiday. My auntie and uncle think the resort is very exciting and they soon get involved in all the resort activities, golf, macrame, etc. Me, I think the only moderately interesting thing about the resort is Johnny Castle. Johnny is a dance instructor at the resort and he has a very nice body. As it turns out, Johnny ends up teaching me the mambo in preparation for a dance performance together, and so we start spending a lot of time with one another. In fact, one night, Johnny and I find ourselves alone in his cabin. At first, we're just talking about our favourite 80s television shows and pop songs, but there's something in the way the discussions about popular culture can bring people together, and hence the conversation soon leads to Johnny and me having sex. The thing is, while Johnny looks very nice and all, I do not really feel very in the moment. In fact, as Johnny is panting and thrusting, I feel very detached from the experience. It is like I'm a bystander, looking on as someone else is having sex with Johnny. And that someone else is a Caucasian man with a moustache. This man is tall and very well built. He's wearing a leather cap and leather chaps. His name? Bruce. So I read that particular passage kind of to show you what is my main technique in my work, which is I kind of refashion or reshape or remake existing, materials in our culture, different texts and tropes and genres and social scripts and so on. I displace them from their usual contexts, and then I divert them into new contexts within my own work. So you can see that I'm doing that with the film Dirty Dancing, along with its, some of its plot points and characters and tropes and so on, and shifting them, diverting them, inserting them into new contexts within my own fiction. In that case, my piece, Dirty Dancing. And in doing that, in sort of resituating that film within my own work, I'm imbuing that film with, new meanings, new, somewhat different meanings as well, and different resonances as well, including queer resonances, racialized resonances and more. And this is my signature kind of creative strategy in my work. In recent years, I've come to call that strategy of remaking or refashioning morphing. But in my fiction or in that particular book, morphing is also a theme. The book Look Who's Morphing features a protagonist who literally shape shifts into different figures drawn from TV and film and music and books and comics and more. And as I came to find while writing that book, that transformation is a very rich one. It's a very rich trope in the area of popular culture, which is an area that I'm quite interested in my writing. While I was writing that work, or that book, I was particularly interested in writing about identity, but it is very hard to get a grip on what identity is, intellectually, experientially, and not to say that those two are separate either. So I was writing about a notoriously slippery concept, identity. But luckily, we writers, we have access to different techniques where you can communicate your understandings and impressions about things in less literal or less direct ways, and be sort of suitably slippery yourself, and that's what I did with Look Who's Morphing, by drawing on this theme or trope of morphing, and also via this creative strategy that I came to call morphing as well, this kind of diverting sort of cultural sources into new contexts. What else can I say? The genre, the identity of Look Who's Morphing as a book itself is also suitably slippery, and in bookshop, including queer bookshops, it gets stocked in lots of different sections. It gets placed in the short story section, the queer section, the bisexual section, the BIPOC writers section. There was a queer bookstore that placed it in the men's section. It's been in the trans section. And as a book, it's actually unusually open-ended in terms of its it being readable as trans literature or not. These days, I'm writing a book that tackles new territory, religion and truth and divinity. So I'm doing a kind of a different sort of morphing these days, where I'm sort of recasting my fiction to do philosophy, actually. I don't have enough time to discuss that, but I'll be able to speak about it more in our conversation. And I'm going to turn over to the fantastic Farzana Doctor.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. I am quite familiar with Tom's work, but it was so interesting to hear you kind of explain it in those ways. That was really great. So I'm Farzana Doctor, and I'm in the same area as Tom. So Tom, thanks for doing that land acknowledgement piece as well. And big thanks to Greg and William for organizing all of this. And it's lovely to be with all of you, the audience, and all the writers who are presenting as well. So I'm mainly a novelist. I've written 4 novels. I also have a poetry collection coming out fall 2022. So I do a little bit of that as well. And I think all of my work kind of falls into contemporary literary fiction with a little bit of magical realism in there, in more so in some of the books than others. And in all of my books, I've had characters from the community that I'm from, which is the Dawoodi Bohra community, which is a Shia subsect from India. And I've been writing them, I think, in a way to be able to decode all the things that I have been trying to understand about the community. And I take up all kinds of issues. Generally, I fold some kind of social justice issue into each book as a way to explore the issue. And so I generally tend to have lots of queer characters, lots of BIPOC characters, and so on as I'm working through various issues. And maybe I'll talk just a little bit about my most recent novel, Seven, to give you a like more specific kind of glance at my work. So Seven is a novel about a 40-year-old woman who goes to India on a marriage-saving trip with her husband, who's an academic on sabbatical, and their 7-year-old daughter. And she thinks that she's going to be going to India and mostly doing research about a revered ancestor and homeschooling her kid. And in the process, she ends up understanding a lot of things about secrets in the community, and specifically some secrets around female genital cutting that happens within the community. So I'll just read a very short excerpt before I go on with explaining my work. So this takes place in Mumbai in April 2016. And this little scene is between the protagonist Sharifa and her beloved aunt Tasneem Masi. I take a cautious sip. Tasneem Masi pours half her cup into her saucer and sucks the tea down in one long, loud slurp. She pulls up her orna, which slid from her oiled hair to her shoulders, tucking the gauzy fabric around an ear to keep it in place. It is going to happen today, this afternoon. Masi's life is going to change irrevocably. Will she think that her favorite niece has turned traitor? I cannot stop this moving train. What good will it do to announce the crash? After all, Masi can't get off at the next stop. Instead, I sit on the edge of my beloved aunt's couch, scalding tea, burning my tongue. Masi appraises my full cup, raises her right eyebrow. I shake my head. Still too hot. You should do it like me. Her lips upturn into a mischievous smile as she empties the rest of her tea into her saucer, and a wisp of cardamom steam rises in front of her face. With a slight tremor, she lifts the saucer to her lips. See, she says proudly, as though chai drinking is a competition. She doesn't spill a single drop. All right. I tip my teacup to my saucer and chai dribbles onto her glass-topped coffee table. I pat the spill with a tissue. Sorry. Anything wrong, Sharifa? You are quiet today. I meet her gaze. Her eyes are a chestnut brown and shinier than they used to be. These are my eyes too, and the eyes of my mother, my cousin sisters, and our daughters. Masi, I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. There's something I need to tell you. The doorbell tangs, and the coward I am relieved. I inhale courage and wishfully think that I can be loyal to Masi and my mother, my cousin sisters, and our daughters all at the same time. And I'll just stop there because I think my time's up. Yeah. Thank you. And I should pass it over to Leong.
Thank you so much, Farzana. Wonderful reading, really enjoyed it. My name is Leong Ko. I'm calling in from Harlem. Thank very much Greg and William for actually hosting this event, and Kiran for actually getting us together. I'm originally from Singapore, but I have been in New York for the last 17 years. And moving here from Singapore to New York, I came out as a gay man and as a poet. And so for me, sex and poetry are intricately, inextricably intertwined. Sex is a constant concern in my work, and lyric is my primary mode that I actually write in. And the way I see how things played out in my writing through the years is I seem to display a preference in my writing for lyrical sequences. And that perhaps is no surprise because in a lyric sequence, you have kind of self-contained sections. Another way of describing self-containment, of course, is that it follows the trajectory of male arousal and orgasm. But a sequence actually allows you to have that over and over and over again, right? Which of course is a great aim and desire of my heart. And so I'm very interested in that. And so as I continue producing a number of books, and I've just published my 5th collection of poetry, I find myself exploring sequence at greater and greater length, in more and more ambitious scope, stretching myself that way. The other preference that I think arose out of this nexus between sex and the lyric is my preference for persona, for putting on a kind of mask role play, so to speak. That is present in my very, very first collection when I was exploring the Chinese gay tradition, when I actually wrote poems in the voice of the emperor's male favorite or the Taoist magician, right, with their very fluid sexualities. And it has culminated in my latest poetry collection called Corner and Seal, which is very much inspired by Rita Dove's Thomas and Beulah. And so half of my book is actually in the voice of Connor, who is from Nebraska City, Nebraska. And half of the book is in the voice of Seal, who is from Kingston, Jamaica. And you can see, of course, the idea of traveling, crossing borders, which I'm also very, very interested in the concept of these two men coming from a different place and finding themselves and finding each other in New York. So I'm just conclude by actually reading you a poem from this collection. This is the moment in New York when Connor meets Seal, right? And this is in the voice of Connor. 80s dance party on Throwback Thursday. It is time to bring your face into focus before this lens moves below the chin to other features harder to identify as yours. The best image is that of the cheeks. The right cheek and the left cheek do not meet. Like the back of the hand and the palm, like the head of a silver coin and its tail, the cheeks do not see each other except in a mirror or a photograph. This is true of my cheeks until your right brushes my left when we dance. And in that flash of flesh, the coin turns up both head and tail. The back of the hand shakes hands with the palm. Thank you. And I am meeting our next speaker, Angela Meyer, for the first time. So I'm really, really eager to hear her speak about her work. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, this is such an amazing panel to be on. I feel very privileged to be here with you all. So my name is Angela Meyer. I'm coming from Melbourne, Australia, which is the traditional lands of the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. So I would like to pay my respects to them and their elders past and present. I grew up in regional New South Wales, so a very small place, and I write, obviously, and I also work full-time as a freelance editor. So I work with other writers all the time, which is something I love very much. I previously worked in-house in publishing and in a variety of other bookish roles, mixed in with, other kinds of work. I'm bisexual or pansexual. I don't really mind which one of those is used. And I've been out since I was 14, but not to everyone or in all contexts, but mainly because I think, as is the curse of the bisexual, it's often inadvertently hidden or made to feel irrelevant. And I think that's something that very much comes through in my work in all kinds of strange ways. I write in a range of forms and genres. So my novel, A Superior Spectre, is about a man from the near future who has an experimental technology that allows him to inhabit the mind of a woman in the 19th century. And I'd say it's probably more about the entitlements of patriarchy and capitalism than having specifically queer themes. However, I do think my queer sensibility comes through in its blurring of various binaries. So gender, country, city, past, future, old, young, reality, dream, and more. I also think it's hard to pin down what genre my novel is. It's been called science fiction, gothic, literary, speculative historical fiction, and even horror. And my most recent book is this novella, Joan Smokes. By the way, these aren't in the store, unfortunately, because they're not available in the US currently. But yeah, there's lots of ways you can track them down. But also, if any US publishers are watching, you know, the rights are available. So my novella won the Ms. Lexia Novella Award in the UK, which was very cool. It's set in Las Vegas in the early 1960s and is about a woman starting anew, completely reinventing herself after a major trauma. Two things I'm working on at the moment, a novel and a short story, have more explicitly queer characters. I'm really excited about those and getting to that point. How long have I spoken for? Not too long. Okay, I'm going to read you a little bit from Joan Smokes, just so you can get a little taste of that. Because it's sort of, I do write quite short as well. Even with my novel, the chapters are quite short. I really, I love this kind of sparse writing where there's a lot of subtext. So I'll just give you a little preview. She'd seen the Las Vegas Strip in a movie. It is just as technicolor in real life. The radio plays Be My Baby by the Ronettes and she flicks it off because love songs are ice. The lights make sound in her eyes. On one sign, the soprano crescendo of pink. On another, a swooshing fan of green and blue. Everything is tall. The buildings, the cars, waterfalls and feathers. It is orange desert dusk. She does not know where to go. The money has to stretch out until she gets a job. So where is the off-strip, less tall area where the workers live? But she could just pull in here under this sparkling roof and let the valet park the car. She could walk into that casino and play the games her father used to play in Brisbane, swear like him, drink like him. Another dead man. Don't think about it. She's not dressed for the casino, she supposes. She will find a place to sleep and come out in the day and take care of that. She should probably swap out this old Anglia anyway, just in case anyone wants to find her. She feels confident she can disappear here, change her name, become tall. Send a letter to mother. Jack is dead. I'm staying in America. No, lie. Past the strip and there's a more squat neon sign, buzzing pink. Vacancy, vacancy, vacancy. Pull up in front of the reception. Smooth down the hair around her part. Press lips together to spread any remaining lipstick. Push the door open and it jangles. Smile. So that's just a little preview of my writing style, I suppose, in that book. I also have a flash fiction book called Captives. That's an early book of mine. So that takes me to my time, and I'm going to hand over now to Sarah M. Sala. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. That's so lovely hearing from everyone. I am in Upper Manhattan, New York City, the land of the Lenape people. I'd like to acknowledge them. I teach expository writing at New York University because poets have to live. And I co-edit poetry at the Bellevue Literary Review. I'm also a semi-pro cyclist, 6-time marathoner, and dog mom, which I also think invades my work as well. I don't think you can be a long distance athlete or a meditator for that fact and not be poetic in some way. My first poetry collection, Devil's Lake, came out in August 2020 to a roaring pandemic in New York City. So it was really interesting to try to innovate. We did a virtual art gallery, which was really interesting with all queer and gender non-conforming folks. Commissioned a bunch of broadsides, and artists sold art to raise money for various charities. So it was a really cool way to make everything super collaborative and actually help folks in the process. I also joke that because I grew up with 3 sisters, I don't know how to do anything by myself. So if I'm launching something, there's like an army of folks with me. Let's see, intros. I was thinking about this, my relationship to writing and queerness, and I grew up in a really conservative area where I was always trying to just fit in. Like I remember being very small at camp and someone stepped on my hand and I didn't even tell them. I just waited till they just stopped stepping on my hand and moved away. So I really learned, you know, I felt like an outsider, but I didn't know why. And I really learned to just keep my head down, and I never wrote about, you know, queer things, which is hilarious now because when this book came out, it's like this radical, queer, experimental lesbian book. And I'm like, wow, guys, I'm just centering queerness. Like, I'm just writing about gay people in this book, you know what I mean? That we don't want to be trod on and, you know what I mean, erased in all these ways. So, yeah, and I feel like it celebrates queerness in a way too, and demands that folks realize that we deserve joy as well in our lives. When I'm writing about queer themes, I feel like I'm writing at the edge of what I know, that I'm learning about myself. And I feel like that makes my work more interesting and exciting to me, and necessary in that way. I'll read a few poems for you also. I guess I'll just read them now. I'll read the first and last poems in the book. I'm a fan of very short, punchy work. I used to say that I don't trust a long poem, but then I just made myself write them, so I was like, okay. All right, this is called Hydrogen. You want to talk bang? Hydrogen was there at 0000 hours in the coke-colored velodrome of dark matter. Gases checking gases ad infinitum. Chartreuse flare, then a deafening birth. Ions of cosmos cartwheeling pink, red, yellow, green, purple, blue, black in the sphere of night. First, I was a star, then a stain of water, then a kindergartner. And the last poem in the book is called Interior versus Exterior. At my worst, I control the boundaries of my form, and yet when divine, the self permeates the physical world. It's true, the atoms of our bodies grieve each other in death, just like a color doesn't occur alone, but takes meaning from other colors. The moon was a changeable star that ruled men's fate. Water was green and not blue to medieval cartographers. The complexity of ochre begs the viewer to grapple with it. We are swiftly becoming an indoor species. Yet scientists know more about outer space than the Earth's oceans. Humans brought the natural world into their homes to combat the rise of machines. Without us knowing, trees converse via lattice fungi. Gender isn't something one is, but performs. We are a vast assembly of nerve cells, the continents longing for each other. I'm also obsessed with science. That's like the secret in the text, I guess. So yeah, thank you. I'm gonna hand it back over to our amazing William Johnson.
Wow, that was dynamic. What a dynamic assortment of readers. We've got, I mean, I'm realizing now that queer encompasses a lot of things: sex, science, dirty dancing, everything, childhood, and it was just amazing. So thank you all readers. Please buy their books and support local bookstores. Greg, I don't know if you want to put your link again in the chat, but please buy these folks' books. And audience members, please support your local bookstores, your independent bookstores, that is. So let's get started with the Q&A. I have always been obsessed around aesthetics and how identity shapes aesthetics, particularly around queerness. So I'm curious from the panelists and from the readers, how do you define queer aesthetics in your work? Is it actual language, lingo, how we talk, or is it subject matter? So I'm just interested. So let's key it up. What do folks think?
I was thinking about queer aesthetics from a purely visual way. I think my poems, they force you to orient the book differently. They force you to re-envision what you think a poem can do, right? My partner just taught a really interesting playwriting workshop on impossible plays. Like you can have like all actors are babies, or like, a dog gives birth on stage or something you think is completely impossible. And I was trying to think like, what is impossible for a poem? And I guess for me, I'm always pushing the boundaries with form in a way that feels queer to me, that says, yes, I've inherited some of these, like writing proclivities, but I'm going to make them very much my own on the page.
Yeah, I would like to kind of chime in at that point. And it's also interesting to go after Sarah, who I definitely think, I've read a lot of the people in this room, and I think that Sarah is by far the one who really queerifies the most in her poetry, and I love it. I mean, it's really amazing the way that she approaches language and really takes it to unique spaces. So that's a little side advertisement to buy the Devil's Lake. But I'm the type of person who ultimately, growing up, I was the type of person who wanted to be everything but me. And I still am a little bit like that. I wanted to be a person who could just say, I don't have to be kind of bounded by these things that the world gave me. I could be something more ephemeral. I could be something even more eternal. And I ultimately realized over life that actually, I liked a lot of aspects of what I happened to be, even though the world deemed a lot of aspects of what I was as wrong. I liked being a South Asian person, despite growing up in a very conservative and very racially undiverse part of the US. I liked being a queer person, despite having people all around me telling me that being queer was wrong, because I grew up in Georgia in the 1990s, and it was not an easy time to be an LGBT person in Georgia at that time. Now it's changed so much, but still at that time, it was not like that. And I think as I learned to travel, as I learned to distance myself from so many corners of the world and make myself someone that was trying to be a little bit nowhere and everywhere, I realized actually, no, I have to be fully me. And that, of course, comes out in my work. And I think that the act of queer writing is not necessarily the act of textually writing about queerness. It's not necessarily about actively shaping your work as a queer person. It can sometimes just be the fact that you are a queer writer. That is just a space you inhabit. And as you write, as you approach the text, that'll inevitably show. And it's okay to leave that process as it is.
Yeah, if I may chime in too, when we ask questions like, what is queer aesthetics, I'm always afraid of such questions because it always seems to demand a definition of some sorts. And I just, want to evade definitions, right? Because I think that's part of queerness, right? That we do not want to be boxed in and labeled and defined. Instead we want to be an alternative to what is already out there. So, I very often think of, of the Tao, the Chinese Tao, and how Lao Tzu would actually describe that as, the way that can be named is not the way. So I think of that as queer, because if you can name it, that's not queer. The next thing is queer. It's a thing that cannot be named. So it's almost ineffable in some way. And I like that because it gives me that, motivation, that propulsion to keep writing, to find out what is out there.
I certainly relate to that. And I think that even my queerness and writing sort of happening at the same time when I was younger was almost like when I was becoming attuned to this sort of gray spaces, like that was the radar, this sort of in between that I didn't necessarily see reflected around me in a very heteronormative small town that I lived in. And it's like writing became a part of how I dealt with my understanding of this in between and how I couldn't articulate it in any other way, even if it wasn't explicitly what I was writing about. And I think that's sometimes where I went towards speculative fiction and things like that as well, with like, or ghosts, or, you know, things that are a bit inexplicable and a bit in between. So I think, but then again, with a broader, definition of a queer aesthetic, I've read a lot of queer works that are also very more, I guess, what you'd call kind of by the numbers, like a crime novel or a romance novel. But what I've seen with those often is a bit of a self-awareness or a wryness, or a little bit of a kind of a sense of humor. There is this sort of other awareness that's coming into that is, I find, really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, what shall I think that queerness, I think, can operate, you know, in so many different ways in my own work and the work of other writers that I know. And, you know, queerness can operate at the level of meaning, you know, where, you know, I think that maybe if I talk about myself, or actually maybe I'll talk about one of my queer artist heroes, which is the artist Tom of Finland, you know, who did these homoerotic drawings of these macho, muscly men with giant cocks engaging in rampant queer sex. And he took these figures of these masculine men, but, you know, kind of refused or refuted their sort of given meanings, you know, and said, oh, actually, I think that, you know, these men can mean more than these conventional meanings. And I think that's the kind of lead that I take in, or approach I take in my own work, is that, you know, you sort of reach beyond this sort of the sort of given meaning to some sort of some other multiple meanings, some kind of excess of meaning beyond that. I also think that queerness is like it's a kind of ethical and political project for a lot of writers, and for myself as well. But actually, if I go back to the kind of sort of like this kind of excessive meaning beyond what like is given to us, I think for me in my own work, there's also like a sort of an aesthetic excess that goes along with that, where it's kind of like in my work, I'm sort of like, no, you know, I think, for example, the film Dirty Dancing can mean so much more than, you know, or what we might be led to believe. But then there's this sort of aesthetic excess that goes along with that, where I kind of venture into sort of hyperbole and sort of, you know, fantasy and sort of fanciful embellishment on all those sorts of things. So it's kind of about sort of taking some existing meaning and then following it kind of rampantly to like these sort of really extravagant sort of implications. I think that's, I kind of, you know, in my own work, I sort of latched onto sort of other kinds of queer aesthetics as well. I think, you know, like camp, glamour, and a sense of the spectacular, and different forms of kind of play and guile. And this sort of idea of excess sort of keeps creeping into my own work.
I don't have much to add after all of those really great answers. So I can just leave it there, and maybe we can go to the next question.
Well, I actually wanted to follow up a little bit about what Tom said about, you know, camp and melodrama and this heightened emotionality. And a lot of those feelings are things that we in community talk about with each other. So I also have this idea that, you know, queer aesthetics is sometimes insider talk that we put inside our work, whether it's camp or melodrama or irony or extreme sincerity. And I want to know if people found that in their work too. I mean, do writers, do you pull from some of the kind of in-community communications and emotions and feelings in your work? Do you pull from that, some of our kind of in-community cultural touchstones?
I definitely have, in a couple of my novels where I am explicitly addressing queer content in terms of queer characters. I've had I've had my characters sort of addressing the issues of the time for when those novels were written, of what was happening in the queer community around politics. So in one of my novels, there's a lot of discussion, and very much within like the vernacular of the time around, gay marriage, for example. In a later novel, I had a queer youth trying to educate a middle-aged man about trans issues, so I think bringing in the language, what we are talking about, how we are talking about, is very much how I brought it into the novels. Yeah.
How has, for the writers, how has queerness changed in your work? Has your writing process has grown or changed or evolved?
I could jump in. Oh,
Go ahead.
do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I was still thinking about the last question too, about language, almost like insider versus outsider language. And as I'm writing, I don't really think like, here's a queer term I'm gonna like slip in, or like, I mean, probably more often in text messages, I'll make sure that I refer to the person I married as my wife or my husband, for folks that don't recognize our relationship. And I think I actually have a few poems where I'm writing outward to other people. Like there's a poem in the book called Nature versus Nature, where as I was assembling the book, I felt like there was a little bit of a gap in the book and I wanted to fill it. And I was sitting in a public library in LA, and I was like, I just want to write a poem that contextualizes being queer, that says, before I was born, I was gay. Before the universe was created, I was gay. Before there was matter, I was gay, because being gay belongs to the universe. So in that sense, I guess I'm dramatizing or contextualizing my place in the world as not an outsider, but as one who belongs, because we all belong, whether we want to or not, right? We all belong to each other in some way, to quote Sebene Selassie. So I guess for me, the only time I'm being political is probably in a text message. But in my own writing, I guess I'm just allowing myself to be, just making the personal universal, if I'm doing it well, anyway.
Again,
Go on, Kiran.
No, well, I went against Sarah last time, so maybe G can this time segue, and then maybe I'll come in.
Sure. I know the community question is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because I also related to family, right? And how for so many LGBT people, our family is our chosen family very often, rather than our biological family. And so as writers too, I guess, we choose our community, we choose our family. And for me, certainly, as a poet, I have found my community and family with, queer writers, right? Like, W.H. Auden, like Tom Gunn, for example, or Gregory Woods, people like that. But how things have changed for me is that I'm also discovering a strain of queerness in writers who seem to be straight. So for example, Rita Dove's, Thomas and Beulah. I was astonished when I studied that book, how queer Thomas is in that book, right? Because his, friend from a very young age, drowned, and forever afterwards, Thomas cannot forget him and feels as if he's living his friend's life and not his own life. And that is so powerful and so moving to me that I really wanted to bring that out into the open. And so it was kind of like my book, Connor and Seal, is kind of a reinterpretation of Thomas' relationship, as if kind of like what could have been if Thomas had been queer and if Thomas had actually met with a guy, in New York City instead of staying in Ohio. So finding community, I think, is so much an impulse behind so much queer writing, I think.
Yeah, gee, I agree. I remember reading Dancer from the Dance for the first time, which for folks, it's a novel that's written totally in a camp voice. And I remember reading that thinking, oh my gosh, this is what queer literature can do. It can just, tell me about myself that I already know, that I didn't know, if that makes any sense. But it was like, oh, so this is an aspect of queer aesthetic that was very in community that I found fascinating. And I'm also just interested to see, and that was written in, I guess, what, 1979? But I'm interested from you folks, is like how, what do you kind of consider like kind of your queer voice right now? Like you're writing about, what aspects of queerness do you find interesting? I mean, it can be camp or melodrama, or it could be other things, but I'm just interested to hear what aspects of queerness folks are really interested in interrogating in their work right now.
I could answer that. With my first book, I was really interested in discussing queerness in relation to, I guess, matters around identity. I knew at the time that identity was, or considering queerness in terms of identity might be quite limiting, even rather predictable, right? I guess I took it on with this feeling that I might better do something less predictable. With what was admittedly a really predictable focus, but these days I'm really interested in exploring religion and divinity. I'm interested in like the queerness of religion and divinity, but in ways that reach beyond saying, queer people can be religious too. And in fact, in my work, like the level of character, queerness in terms of level of character, it's a bit, it's not a great concern for me. It's like I said, it's more about the level of meaning. But so the ways that I was sort of interested in like queerness of religion and divinity, I've had to think about, like in religion, the way that, there can be these non-normative bodies, for example, these malleable bodies that can kind of change in their sort of function in ways that, and act in ways that aren't conventionally thought of as possible. I've thought about religion, encounters with religion as sort of encounters with, unknowable, with the unknowable, and also challenging us in terms of what we know, which I feel like is kind of been part of my own encounters with queerness too. It kind of becomes this, to queer something is to kind of really this kind of process of kind of disorientation around challenging, why do we believe the things that we believe, and who gets believed and why, and also kind of around religion as and the divine as being sort of discomforting and strange, and sort of making connections to queerness and that way. And those are some of my present interests.
Something that comes to mind for me is that years ago I was on a panel, and I had just written my first novel, which was about a South Asian lesbian and the way that a kind of a doomed love triangle forms around her. And at the time, I was on a panel with someone who was a far more experienced writer. She had written 4 books at the time, and she said, I'm really getting tired of writing queer characters and queer stories. And I remember listening to her and thinking, how can you get tired of that, right? Like, this is endless what you can do. But one of the things I think I understand now as I keep moving through my work is I'm kind of interested in writing a variety of stories. At the beginning, I think I wrote specifically the content that was about lesbians and queer women and so on. And I've become interested in kind of expanding that and writing different stories that just fit whatever I need to write. So for me, I think a lot of what queerness is about for me is looking at what it means to be an outsider within a community, and what it means to look into that community as the outsider.
Just jumping in on that sort of changes over time and queerness in your work, I think to talk about maybe a different aspect, the sort of emotions that I've experienced, especially at sort of formative stages, associated with my queerness and responses to it. I think they sort of work their way into the characters as well. So some are obviously very positive, the fullness and richness of it, and the desire and the ecstatic emotions. But I think also there was a lot of working through that I've done with some of my characters in particular, which is shame and inadequacy and aloneness or struggling to connect with people. And I think it's quite funny that some people have even found my nastiest character quite sympathetic, because I think it's the genuine emotions that I've given him, but I sort of really stretched out, you know, but the point that they began at. But I think that my writing is about 5 years behind me psychologically, and I think it was Sarah before that said about writing at the edge of what you know about yourself, and I really related to that, because I feel so immersed now in a very positive and celebratory queer community, and I feel like it's taken a little while for my writing to catch up, but that's also very fun and very exciting, because that's starting to come out a bit more in what I'm writing now. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think you'll probably all relate when you look back at your work from like 5-10 years ago and can see much more of what was going on there psychologically.
And what is that process like for you, Angela? Like, is it hard to do, to look back, or do you like just say, okay, that was a moment and it was a great moment or an awkward moment, but I'm fine with it? Or is it just like, I can never look at that again?
It feels a bit awkward, only because it's like I want to explain even to like new friends and queer friends of like what possibly was going on there, but most of the time I can trust that they will understand, because you know they may have gone through similar kinds of processes, but yeah, it can be awkward. But I try to just own my work and be like, that was published at that date, and you know people understand time passes and things like that, and I'm still proud of the exploration as it's captured, I suppose. That's still interesting. Yeah.
Well, one thing I would acknowledge, we're in a really weird time right now, right? We're in a pandemic, and that's affecting us all in all sorts of ways. So I wanted to kind of gauge, you all, engage with the writers to see how the pandemic has really affected or influenced or blocked your writing practice, or changed or transformed your writing practice.
Well, I can very easily answer that. For me, I think I'm one of the few people who feels like I benefited a little bit from the pandemic. I feel like for me, it's been a copious amount of free time that used to be dedicated to like traveling or doing other things, and now it's going back to that a little bit. But you know, I've taken up like book reviewing. You know, that was something I did to while away a lot of that free time, and it's been a wonderful thing for me. I mean, it's the first time that I've like been critically engaging with so many authors, and so many of you I met through that practice actually, and it was a really amazing process. So I've been really grateful for that. And if I didn't have this excess of free time to just be able to read like a book of 200 poems in one day, you know, then I would have probably not been in that space, you know. So I've been very grateful for the pandemic, and it's also affected, you know, because it all has to be told in real time. So next year I have to really be on point with what's happening. And so it's helped me a little bit with the family drama, because son has to come back because of COVID. It destroys his life in that foreign country he lives in. He is economically devastated, and he has to come back home in a way that he hasn't wanted for a decade. So it actually amps up the tension a little bit in the family, because he has to return, but they don't really feel like, none of the three members are like, oh, can we really handle this, you know, after living a decade apart? So that really helped me in a certain way. So I think I'm one of the few people who's benefited a little.
I found writing to be a little bit harder than usual. I've usually haven't needed much external accountability to get my writing work done, but I found myself feeling just a little slower and more tired in my writing. So one of the things I did early on in the pandemic was I started a Facebook group called #WritingSprint. And it's a place where any writer can announce that they're doing a writing sprint for an hour, so that, you know, you can kind of join in with them and feel like you're not alone. And so that helped me a lot to just keep my butt in the chair so that I could keep writing. But most, you know, the last 4 months has really been about figuring out how to promote a book in the pandemic without any kind of face-to-face contact with readers. And so that's also been a really interesting process to learn, like, how do you do Instagram Live, and how do you attract people to events, and how many events should you be doing, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's been more my process as a writer, is figuring out how to promote.
I think you've done a great job at it, Farzana, I have to say. Yes, if you're like the authors I know, like you just amazing, like your success in promoting. But I would have thought, to be honest, that if any writer I knew could have done so well in promoting their work during a pandemic, it would be you, actually, out of all the authors that I know. Side note. To answer the question myself about the pandemic, I think space to write has been like it's had the most impact in terms of space to write. I used to I do have a studio space separate from where I live, but I haven't been going and using it very much. It's a shared studio space with other artists, and so I felt kind of worried about going because of COVID. I also had an artist residency. A lot of my current manuscript has been developed through writers residencies, and I had to postpone a residency in the US. But in terms of my writing itself, something that I think I've noticed, which I think it's not purely due to the pandemic, because it's sort of dovetailed in with other changes in my own writing, is that in my work I've sort of I've sort of sharpened the need for me to sort of have engage in sort of more direct ways of explaining and analyzing things, and being didactic as well. And I think it's not purely the pandemic, but I think it's just a time when I felt the need to kind of speak more plainly and directly to the reader. So like I said, queerness in my writing has always been a kind of ethical and political project anyway, but I think I've become more, more didactic in my work.
So it's actually transformed your style, in a sense.
I think it was already starting to happen anyway, because I was engaged. I've been engaging with, really complex sort of subject matter around religion and truth, and philosophical approaches to these. So I've been engaging with scholarly work that, conveys in certain very direct, with a certain level of directness that may not happen so much certainly in my own fiction. Right from where you go, and now here are my arguments. My arguments are this and this, and I'm going to lay out this and this, So I think that engagement with scholarly material has affected that. But I also have felt actually that, like, in this time, and this time also when, where, sort of our understandings about what we know during the pandemic, what carries weight as a fact, or what carries weight as truth. And of course, with the state of US politics as well, and, the kind of widespread disillusionment with truth, that it's actually encouraged me to speak more plainly than I certainly would have, if I had paid attention to my writing lecturers, who would tell me to, show and not tell. I wouldn't be doing this, but yeah, I guess a kind of a more political edge has kind of sharpened, in my work.
For me, the pandemic was just part of a compounding series of events, unfortunately, that included a significant personal loss and grief, and sort of huge responsibilities I've never had to face before. So I was midway through a novel manuscript when my dad got sick, and he died during the pandemic, and the weirdest thing that happened with my writing is that it actually became more hopeful, sort of more expansive, rather than becoming sort of weighed down by what I was going through. It's like I needed to do that. So I don't actually know if what I had been writing was any good or publishable. Like I'm not as closely able to look at it at this point because I still have these layers going on. But I've got people reading it for me at the moment, which is really good, you know, those outside points of view. But I'm just quite amazed at what happened to my brain there, and how writing always gives you ways to explore, I'd say explore love, actually, love and living, and even when the worst possible things are going on.
Yeah, I'm based in Manhattan. As I said, in New York City was really hammered in March and April with the pandemic. And we live not too far from a hospital. So we heard sirens, you know, for 24 hours a day for a period of time. So it was really difficult too. As an educator, I had, I think, 2 days maybe to go from in-person classes to online and remote. So it felt like 3 times more work, and my students, you know, I really wanted to be there for them. A lot of them were losing their housing, having international flights. I know folks who had COVID who lost folks during the semester as well. So I'm also a person who struggles with chronic migraines and chronic pain. So I've kind of given myself over to not writing in really intense periods, but kind of, as Zadie Smith says, just be listening and open. I very much, you know, read and devour text, and I'll take notes constantly without any kind of editorializing, just writing things down. And I found that when I come back, I'm like, oh, this is a poem, or, oh, this is really great work for me to just like edit. So yeah, I think of these stressful times as expending a lot of ourselves. And then when we have a pause point, I'm about to be on break if I ever grade the final essays that I need to grade. Then I just think of myself as a container that I fill up with rest, with friends, with, you know, queer family, with art as much as we can, and to honor all the folks that we've lost in this pandemic. And hopefully in January, looking forward to a new administration. And the only hopefully part, like, it's happening, but we've been, as Americans, we've been waiting a very long time for this. 4 years, which felt like 4,000.
Yeah, William, if I may combine, you know, your last 2 questions, the question about what is exciting about, as you know, queerness right now for me, and also about the pandemic, you know, I would say that, you know, the pandemic actually really, it's weird because it's so dystopian, isn't it? I mean, it's really as if the future is here, right? You know, given all the losses that people suffer, and in politics as well as in, you know, medical science. And so, but the other thing that I was actually very interested in too right now, you know, in queerness is technology, especially with AI. So, you know, I find myself exploring much more now in my writing that I've never done before, kind of futuristic orientation. You know, so in Connor and Seal, for example, you know, the story actually goes to 2066. You know, that's when actually Connor dies, right? So, you know, as he gets older, he actually is able to, you know, have get a sex robot to join, you know, his relationship. Now, how would that change the relationship, right? He's able to also go out to have what I call AI parties, which stands for not for artificial intelligence, but artificial insemination parties, right? So, you know, it's very, for me, though, to actually interrogate it as a subject makes it seem very foreign. So when I actually write about it, and writing about it in a very kind of familiar setting of a long-term relationship, for me, that feels more real, because that's how I think we have been taking on all these changes in technology, kind of like, you know, amazing. I mean, if we look back, you know, I mean, people 10 years ago would not imagine the things that we have to cope with, right? Whether it's a pandemic or technological changes, but we've been taking them in their stride, and they become normal, right? And so that I want to actually write something like that, in which, you know, it seems so strange and weird and futuristic, but yet how quickly we have actually adapted to it and incorporated it into our day-to-day lives. And so for me, the thinking about how the future is here already, all right, is actually a great stimulus, I think, for imagination and for writing. And I'm so intrigued by Tom's, comments about how he feels that, to address this time that he has to be more direct than ever. I'm intrigued because I find myself having the opposite reaction. I feel as though I need to retreat into more layers of fiction. And so I'm like wondering, why am I doing that, when I could be more direct? And so that really actually raises questions for me too about my own practice. Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, my work is still wildly fictional and, absolutely, flaunts its own, status as fiction. So amidst all the sort of directness of expression, there's very much all the fantasy and embellishment and all those sorts of things that I mentioned earlier.
Directness is a form of indirection. Maybe.
We have about, I think about 5 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken, but I want to take some questions from the audience. Folks, put them in the chat. If you have, I can always ask more questions, but I would love to hear from the audience if they have any questions specifically for any of the authors or for the group in general. So if you do have in the chat. But I guess, one of my questions to follow up to that is, do you feel like your visions are more utopian or dystopian? Or maybe a combination of both? And I guess this is for the, as we move forward in your writing. I mean, this year was a lot. It was a lot. It was, it was a lot. So I'm curious to see how we are envisioning the future in our writing.
I would say neither. I would say that represent life around the world as it is, and in that create many paths to imagine all those futures at once. I think that the future is never truly fully bleak, nor is it hopeful. It's actually a combination of both, always, every year at the same time, and it's just us as humans who choose to interpret it. So I choose to take the middle stance.
Kind of as Angela was saying, with so much going on, and the book that I wrote is pretty intense as it is, I've been really craving just humor, like watching stand-up comedy. I can't handle anything serious right now. I was like, I'm gonna write a really funny book of poems. I don't know how to do that. So I've been reading like humor theory texts, trying to study like what makes something funny, like on the page. Is it just that it's surprising or language that we're not used to? Is it honesty, just really fast, delivered without a filter? So I think in that way, I've been celebrating these modes of coping and healing that I would normally just take for granted, and just really dwelling in them.
I've read theorization about humor too, but what really struck me about it was how deeply unfunny it was. Did you find that? Because I use humor a lot in my writing, so I kind of thought, maybe I should read some theorization about humor, but I was just like, I mean, I kind of felt like humor, like theorization, like comedy kind of gets the last laugh because, theorization comes across as extraordinarily earnest, theorization of comedy. I will just sort of add that I because I do use humor a lot in my own work, I have taken some pleasures in, I mean, I always do take pleasure in writing humor, but even more so actually during this time, because my work is so fanciful, to write about the things that I enjoy, because I often write about things of which I'm a fan, and specific aesthetic interests as well. So, especially with the current book I'm working on, I'm writing a lot about music. So, recently I wrote about power rock ballads. I also often write a lot about stage musicals as well. And so those things have brought me some joy. I do kind of agree that, at least in my own work, it's not a sense of utopian or dystopian either. But I mean, I think right now I've been writing about truth a lot, so we could kind of have quite some bleak, conversations about that one. But I think that not to issue too many spoilers about my own work in this respect, but just that I don't know. I feel like I've had to strike the right kind of note of like accounting for like some of the very serious power relations involved in, dealing with the question of truth, or questions of truth, but also there's something very open-ended about kind of truth being kind of something that, you end up, it sort of ends up getting shifted into this different layer of like making the truth actually happen through your own actions. And so there's something kind of either utopian or dystopian about that, but just really rather open-ended. I know it sounds a little bit kind of abstract or something like that, but yeah, that's where I've been at lately.
Angela, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I don't think that the pandemic has had any impact on whether I'm writing utopia or dystopia. I think I probably just write what I think is. But I was just reflecting on this. I wrote the last, I wrote an epilogue to the novel that got published this year that, I wrote that probably around the beginning of the pandemic. And it's kind of both a bleak epilogue, but it's also fairly hopeful and aspirational, and it takes place in the future. So I guess I was looking for hope around the beginning of the pandemic. So it's interesting to think about that. I've never been asked that question, and I've never really thought about which way I go, but I think I probably aim for hope most of the time.
Yeah, I think my work's always been on what people would call the darker side of things, but then it always has hope in it, I think, and layers to it. But what I've been writing recently, as mentioned, is I would say it's lighter. It's just lighter, maybe in tone and genre, but the themes, I suppose, there's still a lot of like existential exploration among that, and I think something that's always there to invoke a kind of binary again of like life and death. I think there's always something in my work of that we're always dying, we're always living. So like, how do we live well? How do we live knowing that? And yeah, so that's always there, which I don't think is necessarily dystopian or utopian. It's just, yeah, I guess it's existential. It's how to live with, no matter what, there's a pandemic or there's loss or there's, how to go forward.
Yeah, I find myself imagining dystopia quite a great deal in my own work. I just published a hybrid work of poetry and prose called Snow at 5 p.m. Translations of an Insignificant Japanese Poet. It's basically about the discovery of a bunch of translations of haiku that becomes famous, and then there's a fictional commentator 50 years later who writes his commentary on these haiku. And the world is premised on Trump winning a second term and America actually taking a rightward turn decisively with, corporatization, big capitalism, blah, 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 and all those things. And yet writing that, book, I found myself or forced myself to try to imagine the worse America become in order at the end of it to think, right, what it could be, that for me it's so important to actually imagine the worst before I begin to imagine what is possible and what is hopeful. Because otherwise I feel like I am deluding myself in some way, in indulging in some kind of make-believe. Of course, and I think those of us, who are on the liberal or progressive side, I think we believe very strongly what we, doing. We act on our beliefs and our convictions, and yet, I also want to always be, scrutinizing my own self for blind spots. And so that's what I write to. I am trying to write to what I think are possible blind spots in my own beliefs. in the hope that, when we see those blind spots, we can actually truly move forward.
That's good. And on that note, that's going to be our final note for the evening. I want to thank all the readers. This was absolutely nourishing, so thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation and being in conversation with you all. Greg, thank you for hosting this event. And Kiran, thank you for pulling this all together. Yet again, please buy these authors' books. Find them, buy them, buy from
Thank
independent
you.
bookstores or directly from the authors. So thank you.
You.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, everyone. We have one more Bureau event this year, which is on Saturday, and it's a long-running queer storytelling event called Tell, which we've been hosting since 2014. So I hope you'll join us on Saturday. If not, I hope we'll see you in the near future. And I can't wait to be back at the Bureau and hosting you in the flesh. It will happen. So good night, everyone.
I believe that to be true. Good night, everyone. Good night.
Yes.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Be safe.
Good night, everyone.
Be safe. Bye-bye.
Night.
Good night.